Muy buenos días, mi nombre es Israel Moreno Salto, de parte de la Sociedad Mexicana de Educación Comparada, la Facultad de Ciencias Humanas de la Universidad Autónoma de Baja California, la Facultad de Filosofía y Letras de la Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México y la Universidad Autónoma Metropolitana, División de Ciencias Sociales de la Unidad Xochimilco. Les doy la más cordial bienvenida a este segundo día de trabajo del quinto encuentro de Educación Internacional y Comparada. La conferencia magistral de hoy está a cargo de la distinguida socióloga de la educación, la profesora Susan Lee Robertson. La profesora Robertson nos engalana este evento con su conferencia titulada Just Educational Futures, traducido al castellano, Futuros Educativos Justos. A continuación, ofreceré una breve reseña del trayecto profesional de la profesora. Susan Lee Robertson cuenta con un doctorado en Sociología y Política por la Universidad de Calgary, en Canadá. Se ha desempeñado como profesora en Sociología de la Educación en diferentes universidades ubicadas alrededor del mundo, en países como Australia, Canadá, Nueva Zelanda y el Reino Unido de Gran Bretaña. Actualmente se desempeña como directora de la Facultad de Educación de la Universidad de Cambridge en Inglaterra. Al concluir su gestión al final de este mes, asume la dirección de la Escuela de Educación, Cultura y Sociedad de la Universidad de Monash en Melbourne, Australia. En semanas recientes fue nombrada como vicepresidenta de la Sociedad de Educación Internacional y Comparada, CIES por sus siglas en inglés, y en un par de años asume la presidencia. Ha publicado extensamente en revistas de alto impacto y editoriales de prestigio mundial sobre gobernanza global de la educación, transformación del Estado y nuevos capitalismos, poder y conocimiento, construcción de regiones y educación, cultura política económica de la educación, justicia social, el trabajo de docentes y teoría del espacio y educación. La profesora tiene dominio del sistema educativo mexicano. En el 2021 publicó en coautoría con un servidor el artículo titulado Sobre la vida de los números en el gobierno del sistema educativo mexicano, un relato multiescala de PISA de la Oecd, en la revista Globalización, Sociedad y Educación. Asimismo, está por publicarse también coautoría con un servidor en julio del presente año de manera digital el capítulo del libro titulado La OCDE, Vehicularidad de las Ideas, Agujeros de Gusano y la Reforma Curricular 2018 de la Formación Inicial Docente en México. Con esta breve reseña le doy la bienvenida a mi mentora y supervisora de doctorado, la profesora Susan L. Robertson. Dear Professor, good morning here in Mexico and good afternoon in England. On behalf of the Mexican Society of Comparative Education, the Faculty of Human Sciences of the Autonomous University of Baja California, and our other hosts, I would like to welcome you to our 5th Conference of International and Comparative Education. We are pleased that you have taken some time out of your busy agenda to share some insights with us. In advance, I thank you for your time and intellectual generosity. And without further ado, I pass the floor to you. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Israel, for that very generous introduction. Can I also say thank you also to Carlos and Zaira for their very, very warm welcome. It's a great honor to be invited to present at your 5th International Congress on Comparative and International Education. And I say that with a great deal of gratitude also, having most recently been elected as the president or president-elect for CIS, which is the Comparative and International Education Society, which is the Society of the United States. So the invitation to speak broadly on the future of education is timely and important. And I'm just going to share my slides. And while I'm doing that, to also say, let me just go back to the beginning here. the timeliness of thinking about just education or educational futures aligns very nicely also with the way in which many of the international organizations themselves have, and particularly UNESCO, which is the United Nations Education, Culture and Society organization, has actually been thinking about what about the future? What kind of future are we both trying to imagine and trying to realize? So the title, my title here, Just Education or Educational Futures, wants to place imagination and the future at the heart of what I want to reflect on today. As Kerry Facer reminds us, we often take for granted the relationship between education and the future, not only because children are the future, but education itself plays a key role in creating future citizens. So ideas of the future and desires for better futures are also profoundly constitutive of educational practices. And we see this particularly with international organizations who often aim, for example, the OECD, which is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, aim to grasp hold of future making in order to realize a particular kind of future. Having said that, the future, by definition, is unknown and thus open, and it therefore matters who is doing the imagining, which futures are considered more desirable than others, and for whom. So, for example, is it a future that might privilege some of the developed countries and their economies over and above other societies, their economies and culture? So in my keynote today, what I want to ask are these three questions. What are the problems facing education systems around the globe that need resolving? So this is a moment of diagnosis. Second, which futures are being imagined by whom? In other words, this is a moment of prognosis. In other words, trying to imagine what might be tomorrow, next week, next month, next year, the next decade. And finally, and this is the most important part of my talk today, what frameworks might we use to evaluate the desirability or not of these proposals? In other words, what kinds of ethics of the future? And I hope in your various discussions that you might actually take up the question of the frameworks that we use to evaluate, embrace, or indeed, in some cases, reject certain proposals for future making. Kerry Facer outlines a set of orientations to the future that can be framed as 5 questions. And she frames them in this way. What will education be like in the future? Will we face climate change, for example, in the way in which we're currently confronting it? What about mass migration as we currently see it? Secondly, what sort of education will prepare students for the future? And that's to some extent an open question, and there are different views on that. How can students think reflexively about the future? In other words, what kinds of knowledges, skills, values, and indeed soft skills might we, and critical reflexive skills, might we be deliberately engaging with students in classrooms, schools, universities, colleges, colleges of further education, all of these different spaces of education that comparative and international educators think deep and hard about. And finally, how can education be liberated from the future? and how might education heal the future? In other words, if we liberate education from the future, does it enable us to do different kinds of things now? And this particularly final question, how might education heal the future? The future for some individuals, families and communities might not be the future that they particularly want. So let me think first about ruptures in the future, asking what will education be like in the future and how might we prepare students for this future will always be shaped by an act of imagination on the one hand and experiences of the present and the past on the other. Such questions become urgent in moments of crisis and major upheaval, placing the matter of innovation and the future of education high on our agendas. COVID-19 and the global pandemic is one such example. And here we are in 2022, making sense of present struggles and what the future of education might look like. We know the global pandemic has not only made existing economic, social, and technological inequalities in our societies and education systems more visible, but it has exaggerated them. More than 1.5 billion students, if we reflect on COVID, and youth across the planet have been affected by school and university closures due to COVID-19. In 2021, UNICEF reported that globally, schools for more than 168 million children have been closed for almost a full year. Furthermore, around 214 million children, or 1 in 7, have missed more than 3/4 of their in-person learning. So these are major challenges facing the world of education. According to Unesco data, more than 888 million children worldwide continue to face disruptions to their education due to full and partial school closures. And I have no doubt in Mexico that these kinds of global figures resonate across the different cities, urban and rural areas, and across different states. The lack of connectivity and devices excluded more than 1/3 of children from pursuing learning remotely. And while we might say that this was a significant problem in Mexico, let me just say in the case of the United Kingdom, where we might expect better outcomes, that in fact, the results in a country that ought to be significantly able to redistribute its wealth has been shamefully inept or unable to ensure that every child has access to the means to participate in education. In the UK, the Social Mobility Commission that thinks about how resources are redistributed to ensure fairness provided evidence that nearly 1 in 3 children in the UK now live in poverty. When the pandemic hit, only 51% of households earning quite a low wage, but nevertheless regarded as a kind of a wage to survive on, had only 51% had home internet access compared to those who earn a much more kind of, and it's not a significant wage, but nevertheless who earn more or less the wage of the kind of middle income earner. Yet the assumption was that all learners would go online and continue schooling as usual. Ruptures of this kind and scale trigger debates about the current state of a society and possible or better futures. Yet struggles over which future is to be imagined and made possible tend to be episodic and emerge at moments of crisis and deep rupture. So, for example, we can think of the Great Depression in the 1930s, the civil rights movements in the United States in the 1960s, the economic crises that were global in the 1970s and the 1990s, the 2008 financial crisis that certainly affected not all parts of the world, but many parts of the world. And more recently, the rise of authoritarian populist politics in various parts of the world, certainly including in the Latin American world, in the United States in 2016 and onward. And then if we go into 2020, a global pandemic that has closed schools and universities. Anne Meesh describes these moments as sites of what she calls hyper-projectivity. And what she means by that is in a moment of crisis, and this is why the conference and keynote and theme of the conference, thinking about the future, is specifically one of these moments, a site of heightened, future-oriented public debate about possible futures. And here I would remind you of the recent report that came out last year from Unesco, from the International Commission on the Futures of Education, and the report Reimagining the Future of Education toward a New Social Contract is one such moment amongst a number of efforts to think differently about the future. In these moments, an array of different kinds of actors enter the business of future making, from futurists who actually specialize in trying to crystal ball gaze and try and see the future, to policymakers, to corporations, to international organizations, global consultancy firms, and social movements. And I'm going to reflect on some of those actors and the sorts of thinking that they're doing, and to suggest that in fact it's imperative that organizations such as your society, yourselves actually begin to take these debates quite seriously and look at ways in which you can intervene in these debates with a rather different kind of set of conversations. Colonizing the future is a political strategy aimed at realizing a particular kind of future present. In other words, if we imagine the future and try and materialize that future as a new kind of present, one that we are either prepared to live with or which suits us, then it does matter who's doing that imagining. And as Arjun Appadurai reminds us, the future is not just a technical fact or a neutral space, but is shot through with affect and with sensation. In other words, we have hopes and aspirations because that future promises a great deal that we look forward to. So how do we diagnose education and economic futures? It would be fair to say that the international agencies, national governments, such as in Mexico, the corporate world, and some education researchers have had innovation and the future of education on their agenda for some time. Beginning in the 1990s, the OECD, which is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, advanced the argument that education systems were no longer fit for purpose. They were described as reflecting the old years of the agricultural rhythms and the industrial age, whose yearly patterning, in fact, didn't fit the 21st century. In other words, why would we have school holidays to fit an agricultural cycle and so on? The OECD argued that with new digital technologies, it was now also possible to personalize learning, while innovations in brain imaging stimulated research on how neuroscience might inform classroom practices. For the OECD, like the World Bank, major changes were needed in the governance of education systems to enable more private actors to enter the sector and where teachers would be encouraged to draw on evidence of what works to make pedagogical, curriculum and assessment decisions, whilst more competition between schools was favoured to drive up standards and create new system efficiencies in education. Much like the work that you've done yourself, Israel, on the analysis of PISA and the OECD, their innovations were proposed to advance through large-scale assessments and so on across a number of countries, a series of changes in national systems to actually enable them to make the race to the top. Now, that's a very specific way of thinking about what education should be about, a competition where national governments embrace the OECD's results and then see themselves as in competition with other nations. Similarly, a series of foresight and scenario-based initiatives were aimed at creating a new kind of school. So foresight, can we see and scan the horizon out there? Can we actually imagine scenarios? For instance, schools as they used to be, schools where essentially it's schools as learning organizations, or schools in a highly competitive free market. All of these were scenarios that might draw policymakers and practitioners into a different kind of conversation about what kind of education system for the future. So they were to stimulate conversations about what kind of teacher, student, education system, economy and society for a future knowledge economy and how to bring this future about. At one moment in that conversation, UNESCO had a long and big conversation about an alternate imagined future, the idea of a knowledge society and not just a knowledge economy. However, the idea of a knowledge economy ended up becoming the dominant way of thinking about the future. Now, more recently, the OECD has been confronted with the outcomes of more than 3 decades of neoliberal policies. Rather than all boats rising, which was the promised future, considerable evidence has emerged that show that income inequalities and poverty in many OECD countries has in fact been rising. In other words, you get this visual image of the tide going out and many families, communities and nations finding themselves, in fact, not as rising boats, but in fact, as boats that are actually, to some extent, either sinking to the bottom or actually grounded in the lack of tide. In 2014, Thomas Piketty also pointed to the accumulation of significant wealth by a tiny percentage of corporate elites whose imagined future, the free market neoliberalism, had actually enabled them to become particularly privileged. The rise of corporate elites, their wealth not circulating back into the supporting of public services, but rather found their way into tax havens. And we actually know the outcome of that for individuals, for families, for publicly funded systems, and so on. Most recently, the OECD has acknowledged this is indeed a problem and that, in fact, divided societies between those who benefited from globalization or the globalizing of neoliberalism and those whose lives and futures have become more precarious. The OECD itself has begun to explore other kinds of indicators that include the idea of global competences, which is added onto the PISA program. So it recognizes it's been part of a future-making set of scenarios that try to imagine a race to the top and a globally competitive world through their education systems in order to generate economic competitiveness. But in fact, the future that arrived was actually the kind of future that has been particularly problematic, and for the OECD requiring the OECD to think about how we build different kinds of education systems with different kinds of knowledges and skills that include individuals becoming more globally competent. In order to advance this particular alternate, rather different vision of the future, the OECD launched the Future of Education and Skills 2030 project. And it describes, and we can see this idea of a learning compass. A learning compass, the Learning Compass 2030, is described as an evolving learning framework that sets out an aspirational vision for the future of education. And here you might recognize that, in fact, particularly it's well-being that's being targeted and not standards. But also it's the individual that's being targeted, not notions of cohesive communities. There might be some what's regarded as co-agency, or cooperative work between peers, teachers, parents, and communities. But the focus still nevertheless is on the individual student rather than a more relational understanding of how societies, community societies and families, or in schools, might learn together, relate to each other, work in cooperation toward resolving some of our major problems of redistribution of wealth, issues of climate change, major problems to do with inclusion of displaced populations that include migrants and so on. So the OECD's Learning Compass is to emphasize the need for students to learn to navigate by themselves through unfamiliar contexts and to find their direction in a meaningful and responsible way. So we have some shift, some acknowledgement by the OECD that in fact their idea of a globally competitive education system is now somewhat problematic. But I would want to argue that the proposal on the table for the moment, placing the weight of the responsibility on individuals, places too much responsibility on the individuals, because it's very difficult to see how individuals themselves might intervene to ensure fairer tax systems, to ensure the state, in fact, actually engages in redistribution policies, that public sectors like education and health are properly funded, and so on. Individuals might organize in coalitions and so on as political citizens, but the weight of the responsibility on individuals, it would seem to me that we've got some way to go in order to get a different kind of potential future on the table. We might also recognize that in this kind of diagnostic world that includes the OECD, nevertheless, the corporate world is regarded as being a key part of the solution to the problem of what kind of education. And we saw this specifically with the pandemic. We saw the rise of the edtech firms, a number of the big 5 edtech firms, and there'll be specific ones in the Latin American region, but we know the very big global firms that would include Amazon Web Services, Google Education, Google Schools, Microsoft, or the Meta, which is the metaverse, which is actually now Facebook, kind of out there vying to become education providers. The example I want to focus on here is Holon IQ. And it's an education market intelligence agency that scans, so it's doing future scanning, and it's offering us 5 scenarios for the future of learning and talent. Okay? So it's saying when they look at all of the publishing that's going on and the research that's out there, that what they can see is the rise of robotics, education. There'll be parts of the world that's doing education as usual, probably schools, hardware, and ways in which we've historically seen it, the rise of global giants that include the edtech firms, arguing there's much more kind of peer-to-peer, and we have actually seen through the digital mediated peer-to-peer learning, the rise of peer-to-peer that includes peer-to-peer. How do you fund your education? It might be a venture capitalist lending you money, they invest in you, and as a potentially a university student lending you money to go through university, they take a percentage of your salary, presuming you get a well-paid job at the end of it. And these are new financial products kind of out there. And of course, the other element in here, regional rising, that would include the rise of China. So Holland IQ is a very recent firm. It was established in Australia in 2018, and it has expanded very rapidly, and in fact, seeing itself as not just as it looks out at the way in which you can value the worth of education, places it in the trillions of dollars. Global education expenditure on education and training kind of here, it imagines a future of increasing returns to the edtech world. It estimates different sectors. So this is the early years. This is the schooling sector here. This is the post-secondary, so that's university education. Education, of course, takes place also in corporations, and lifelong learning that includes, for instance, a whole lot of non-governmental organizations and so on. This future that is being imagined by the corporate world is a future of profitability, extracting typically money either from families or also money from public or national governments or subnational governments to pass across to the corporate world as providers of education services. What Holland also does, and I'm more than happy for these slides to be shared, is it then breaks down the world of education into what it calls, activities, management activities. The MOOC world, which would be part of the massive open online courses that took off through the pandemic. Coursera, that was struggling prior to the pandemic, which is a massive open online course, a Stanford spin-out, listed, it was a public listing on the stock exchange through the pandemic, and the value of its portfolio increased quite dramatically. Robotics, schools, we're looking at forms of assessment that include Pearson education, who gets to train teachers, and it's not necessarily universities or normal schools, for example, that might be teacher training institutions, but now private for-profit corporate world kind of out there delivering education services. So in breaking up the world of education in this way, what it's actually doing now is actually unbundling, much as the World Trade Organization imagined the unbundling of education as a public service, and seeing that some aspects of that activity could be redistributed out to the private sector. Now, that's fine, but if the private sector get bored or they think there's not enough money in it, they're often very likely to walk away. They also extracting profit. So essentially, the model essentially is, can it go to scale? It's rather standardized in the nature of the provision, and it's sometimes reasonably precarious as well. I want to turn to a rather different kind of future. And earlier I mentioned the United Nations, this is UNESCO, and Education, Science and Culture, and the Organisation for Education, Science and Culture. And over many years has often tried to imagine what kind of future for education in the 1970s, in the 1990s again, and early 2000s, and most recently with their report that they released in 2021. And since its inception, it's been undertaking this kind of work in reimagining our futures together, a new social contract. It was stimulated very much by the same set of concerns that, in fact, actually the OECD was actually faced with. Concerns over growing social inequalities, the loss of solidarity, backsliding on democratic processes, climate change, the erosion of education as a public good, and the rise of unaccountable digital firms in the world of education. So that report, which I encourage all of you to read and to engage in a public discussion wherever you are, in schools, in staff rooms, in classrooms, at congresses, as to what this particular report might offer us going forward. At stake, the report observes, is the future of humanity, and the planet is under threat. It says this: education must aim to unite us around collective endeavours and provide the knowledge, science and innovation needed to shape sustainable futures for all, anchored in social, economic and environmental justice. It must redress past injustices while preparing us for environmental, technological and social changes on the horizon. A new social contract for education must be anchored in two foundational principles: the right to education and a commitment to education as a public, societal endeavour and a public good. This, in my view, stands some distance from the future as imagined by the OECD and the corporate world, represented, for example, by Holon IQ. So how do we make judgments then around which kind of future? We've got the OECD, we've got the corporate world, we've got non-governmental organisations, for instance, many different kinds of futures on the table. The most compelling for the moment, in my view, is what Unesco is presenting to us. But Unesco, we know, often finds it difficult to get resources, to implement those resources in national settings. And over the last, 50, 60, 70 years of Unesco's life, it's often never been the international organisation able to influence national and subnational governments sufficiently to have this particular future actually picked up and taken up and used as a guide to realise just educational futures. This is where I think we get to the importance of ourselves actually having a framework. This is where our colleagues who are philosophers, ethicists and so on, sociologists, people consider themselves comparativists, begin to compare. You're a comparative and international education society. How do we make these kinds of comparisons? How do we adjudicate, make decisions about different visions for the future of education, such as the ones I've presented today? This is an important question for our conference conversation or our Congress conversation. In my view, we need to revisit and reaffirm the purposes of education, its role in producing societies and in making just futures. Is it a commodity to be traded in the marketplace? Yes, say the corporations. What's the problem with that? Is it to prioritise the individual and learning and create human capital, much as the World Bank would say, to be valued alongside the stock of other capitals in the economy? The OECD also commits itself to that view, although recently has been shifting. Is it a human right and a public good to be protected from the market and predatory corporates? You know where my own view sits, but we've actually been hooked, it seems to me, over the last 20 to 30 years, are encouraged to think about it as a commodity. Here I want to turn to Hannah Arendt, the famous political philosopher who reflected deep and hard in the post-Second World War period as to how it was that a crisis so big and so dramatic that would present us with a cataclysmic world war. And she reflected on what she also saw as a crisis in education, where she argued we conflated the idea of learning with education. She says we can learn and learn, but without becoming educated. And here she's actually pointing to the fact that in our learning, we need to learn to be critically reflexive, to ask hard and difficult questions. And it's not just about learning. We can learn skills for the corporate world, some of them important. We can learn skills and learn to become pieces of human capital. That's learning and learning. But what are we learning? And what kind of learning for us to become political citizens, reflexive citizens, citizens who engage and expand the notion of what it would mean to be both political and to public. And here, what she argues, and here I'm coming closer to my conclusion, is that what's important here is that the teacher increasingly must become one of those individuals who's responsible for engaging in education again, and not learning, and who has the responsibility, because of their professional training, for knowing the world and being able to instruct others about it in the artful development of student or human reflexivity. They must be open to diverse ways of knowing, that in Mexico would include multiple knowledges, including indigenous knowledges, multiple ways of doing and being, and the possibility to aspire. The essence of education activity, in her view, is to cherish and protect something of the child against the world for the sake of what is new and revolutionary in every child. This is to more or less quote Hannah Arendt. In other words, we are custodians of those children. They are our future. We depend on them to become the very best that they can possibly be, so that they're not a cog in a wheel, or a little bit of the puzzle that they play is that they have the possibility for transforming the world. Or to quote Unesco's Reimagining Our Futures Together, pedagogy is the work of creating transformational encounters that are based on what exists and what can be built. So this is aspirational. What kind of ethics toward the future might we embrace that enables educators, such as yourselves, to take on the weighty task Arendt assigns to them? Kerry Facer, as we started with in the beginning of my talk, provides some clues here. An ethics of the future promotes reflexivity and multiplicity to enrich the repertoires of experiences and lived lives. And I know Israel, for example, much as we've had discussions, would say musics, multiple forms of creativity and so on, all of these, the world of art, it's not just science, mathematics and literacy, but the multiplicity of the worlds, of the ways in which we're imaginative human beings needs to be encouraged and made possible through our education systems. So we mustn't think of singular trajectories, but think of abundant and possible worlds, because out of that we get innovation. It also asks, who's doing the imagining? What interests do they have in shaping particular futures? And how might they benefit from this future versus another? And we've rehearsed a couple of those already. We might also look at how we let go of certain futures that have become dominant. For example, the idea of modernity as a singular future, the inevitability of progress, or even social mobility as common sense, or growth as common sense. You know, what about degrowth if we're worrying about the environment? Is it always that a nation's wealth is measured by GDP? Probably, possibly not. An ethic of futures, plural, would draw attention to diverse and multiple knowledges of the world, along with practices like intergenerational inquiry, and here's some of the communal, indigenous, and community-based ways of living might become new kinds of possibilities. And finally, then, I would just like to turn to the work of Eric Olin Wright, and he's kind of pleading that we think not of utopia as an impossible future, but actually as a real set of possibilities about where we might go into the future. A real utopia is underpinned by both social and political justice. In a socially just society, all people would have broadly equal access to the necessary material and social means to live flourishing lives. And this does include major adjustments in society around redistribution, around taxation systems, around publicly funded infrastructures, and so on. In a politically just society, all people would have broadly equal access to the necessary means to participate meaningfully in decisions about things that affect their lives. And this is where education comes in. We need to be multiply literate. We need to be also literate around what it would mean to be a political citizen, to make demands around climate change, to make demands around the right to access publicly funded institutions like education and health. This includes the freedom of individuals to make choices that affect their lives and the capacity to participate in collective decisions where that makes sense, which also then affect their lives as members of the community. And we saw experiments, particularly in places like Brazil, and more recently, the World Social Forum was hosted most recently in Mexico, and in the beginnings of the World Social Forum, and it was around 2001 in Porto Alegre, that in fact the World Social Forum begins to present itself as an alternative to the World Economic Forum that currently is meeting this week in Davos. There is much to be done if the weighty responsibility for educators assigned to us by Arendt, this is teachers particularly, but we're all teachers here in the multiplicity of ways in which we are teachers, is to be taken seriously, and the possibility of real utopias is to be grasped. At stake is the future of education for future generations, the future of our planet, and the future of our humanity. This Congress is part of an important global conversation from which must follow actions that translate imagination and hope into futures of social, political, and educational justice. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Professor, for these wonderful insights. Muchísimas gracias, profesora, por esta disertación provocadora y estimulante al mismo tiempo. En estos momentos haré una recapitulación en español de algunos de los puntos principales que abordó la profesora Robertson en su disertación. La estructuró alrededor de 3 preguntas principales. Una de ellas es cuáles son los problemas actuales que están enfrentando los sistemas educativos alrededor del mundo. La segunda pregunta es qué futuros están siendo imaginados y por quiénes. Y la tercera pregunta se relaciona con qué marcos podríamos emplear para evaluar la deseabilidad o no de estas propuestas de futuro por estos distintos actores. Y me regreso a hacer comentarios para cada una de estas preguntas. La primera, ¿cuáles son los problemas actuales? La profesora cita creo que la problemática inmediata que tiene que ver con la pandemia y la afectación de más de 1.6 billones de estudiantes alrededor del mundo. Se asumió que todas y todos los estudiantes se podrían sumar fácilmente a medios educativos digitales, pero hoy sabemos que esto implicó una gran cantidad de problemáticas. Y a partir de esta problemática pasa la profesora a la segunda pregunta: ¿qué futuros están siendo imaginados para atender estas diferentes problemáticas? Y menciona tres actores principales. Primeramente, la Oecd, la Oecd, y comenta que tanto para la Oecd como para el Banco Mundial han argumentado de unos 30 años a la fecha que es necesaria una mayor participación de actores privados en el sector educativo, y que el foco de la educación debe de concebirse como una carrera hacia la cima. Y de esta manera el futuro de la educación ha sido pensado, concebido a partir de la economía de conocimiento. Es así como se vuelve un paradigma, o el paradigma dominante. No obstante, recientemente la OECD ha reconocido que esto ha generado problemáticas y ha invitado a pensar distintas soluciones a estas mismas. En respuesta, generó el proyecto Compás 2030. Sin embargo, la profesora observa que el foco de este proyecto Compás 2030 sigue siendo en lo individual, en lugar de ser en lo colectivo, y de plantearse cómo es que entre todos podemos construir maneras de solucionar las grandes problemáticas que aquejan a la humanidad. Entonces, el foco del proyecto de Compás 2030 es lograr que las y los estudiantes naveguen de manera, pero individual, por estos distintos problemas. Sin embargo, ella argumenta que ese proyecto coloca demasiada responsabilidad en lo individual y descobija o deja de un lado las posibles soluciones colectivas. También cita, por otra parte, el caso de Colin IQ, que es para ella una forma en que las corporaciones están visualizando o entendiendo un posible futuro, que en este sentido, para los empresarios suele ser una educación con un sentido de generación o aumento de ganancias. Por último, nos menciona una organización distinta, que es la Unesco, que también está planteando una forma de cómo pensar futuros educativos. Comenta la profesora que esta tarea la ha hecho desde los 70s, y nos hace una invitación para leer su reporte más reciente, titulado Reimaginando nuestro futuro juntos, un nuevo contrato social para la educación. De manera interesante, observa la profesora que la UNESCO parte de las mismas preocupaciones de la Oecd, pero propone una solución distinta tanto a esta organización como a las corporaciones. Por último, la pregunta: ¿qué marcos podríamos emplear para evaluar la deseabilidad o no de estas propuestas? La profesora nos hace un llamado para que nosotros mismos construyamos nuestros marcos de pensamiento, de intelección, para pensar el futuro. Para ello, menciona la profesora que tenemos que revisitar, reflexionar y discutir los fines y propósitos de la educación, es decir, regresar a esta pregunta que es básica, que muchas veces se da por asentado. Lo anterior es un reto enorme, lo reconoce la profesora, porque desde hace más de 30 años vivimos en un marco dominante donde se concibe la educación como un producto, como un medio para la generación de ganancias. Dice la profesora que requerimos de, reflexiona sobre los aprendizajes que se requieren para lograr ese tipo de conversaciones que ella está promoviendo, o hace un llamado para hacer. Comenta que necesitamos ser ciudadanos críticos y políticos. y para eso es necesario hacer preguntas difíciles. También la profesora pone énfasis en los docentes, en las y los maestros, como actores que tienen la responsabilidad de conocer el mundo, cómo opera, pero a su vez estar habilitados para ayudar a otras y a otros para conocer el mundo también. Y entonces, para este fin, las y los docentes deben de estar abiertos a diferentes formas de entender el mundo, incluyendo diferentes formas de conocimiento. Comenta la profesora que no debemos pensar en un mundo singular, sino en mundos plurales y diversos. Esto implica soltar formas dominantes de cómo pensar el futuro. Por ejemplo, la modernidad como un paradigma singular. Casi al final cita a Eric Olin, en donde él nos invita a pensar en la utopía no como algo imposible, sino como algo alcanzable. Y para este fin, comenta la profesora que debemos aspirar a poseer múltiples literacidades, no solamente aquellas limitadas a las ciencias exactas, lenguaje o matemáticas, sino también otro tipo de literacidades. Muchas gracias. Once again, Professor, thank you so much for these insights. Now we are going to pass on to a session of Q&A, if that's okay with you. Mm-hmm. I have here a couple of comments. You're being live streamed on YouTube, so the questions are over there. I've taken the task of copying them to a worksheet, and I'm going to read a couple of them to you. First, Artemio Cortez, our colleague, says, "Dear Susan, many thanks for your talk. While the participation of private for-profit entities in the state-funded sector is a matter of great concern, during the school closures worldwide, we saw their rapid participation somehow help governments and individual teachers continue schooling remotely. What can under-resourced economies do to provide education that is democratic, decolonizing, and fully public-owned in the context of the present and future pandemics?"
So, Artemio, thank you very much for that, your question. And you're absolutely right. We saw a rapid expansion of for-profit entities, the edtech companies specifically. Now, what we know about the edtech companies, many of those companies actually almost having more resources financially than countries, okay? But also paying very little tax, if any tax. They basically stand to one side and say, well, you know, we're not this or we're not that, and so it's and so they're not properly regulated as we actually know. Amazon, for example, in the United Kingdom, pays very, very tiny amounts of tax and so on. There has been an effort to, and these were a number of countries did come together and began to negotiate around a global tax that means that, in fact, large corporations can't locate themselves, for example, in Ireland, that was actually taxing at the level of, you know, certainly 10, no more than about 15%. And the general view globally now is that, in fact, there will be a tax, a 5% tax that's extracted and taken back out into a kind of global taxation system, and so on. So what we need are new and different ways to, you know, we're thinking about the future of education, Artemio, but in a way where we've got a global world, but national taxation systems. And what we need is global taxation conversations that to some extent reflect the way in which the global corporate world also acts, because it plays nation states off against each other. So that's the first kind of reflection. And then what we know about the wonderful innovations that technology gives us is that, that in fact, you get multiplicities, you know, thousands of people could be reading the one text all at once if they simply had the device. And many of these devices, you know, are not ridiculously expensive. It's the intellectual property that's actually charged on them. And so actually thinking of a way in which we can actually democratize using devices and things like that, access to learning, in ways in which the huge profits, you know, that we actually see the ed tech firms actually extracting, doesn't in some way come back into the education world. Just Microsoft basically say, well, yes, it does, because we actually, you know, fund through the Gates Foundation and so on. But this is up to the Gates Foundation in this particular moment. And it's up to the Gates Foundation particularly to make their own personal decisions about which cause they back and which cause they don't back. But education systems nevertheless are, despite what I just said, are national and subnational and local. And they do depend on resources that come at those particular kinds of levels. So if we're looking at technologies, what we also would want, and you're putting the decolonizing, what we don't want is a kind of set of platforms that basically hardwire in, let's say, English or particular ways of thinking and relating and so on. So all of our infrastructures and our various kinds of resources enable, for example, the supporting and privileging of multiple languages, indigenous knowledges, the curating of the multiplicities, and so on. I mean, these are, I'm not asking at all for a revolution. I don't think we change the world through revolutionary activity. But what I am actually asking is that we can get underway an evolution, a set of conversations and claims that enable our societies to become rather different kind of societies to the kinds that they have become over the last 20 to 30 to 40 years, and even shifting to some extent away from the model that's dominated would actually redistribute resources. Wolfgang Straight talks about we've shifted from a tax state to a debt state, and we need to think our way back into where those who can afford to pay through taxation, corporations that can afford to pay proper taxation, global taxation systems enable the right to education globally to actually be an aspiration still.
Thank you very much, Professor. Another question from Alberto Silva. Is it possible for all countries to reach this future education you're talking about, regardless of their wealth? And is there only one future of education for all the countries, or are there many possibilities?
My answer here is when we have singulars, we have one point of failure. When we have multiplicities, we have the possibility to, on the one hand, honor knowledges that are local, have got tradition and history behind them, and I don't want to romanticize, you know, some aspects of our traditional knowledges don't necessarily set us up well for the future, but some do. Some that privileged wealth, you know, sharing, communal forms of exchange, forms of social cohesion, and so on. So the world that the future I would imagine is full of multiplicities, not a singular. And that's the problem that we've, to a large extent, had from, let's say, organizations like the OECD. It's a one-size-fits-all standard prescription, and you get single points of failure. Multiplicities actually give us a way that we can actually learn from each other, which is what the Comparative and International Education Society in its establishment more than a century ago, kind of globally in France, you know, looking at what we might learn from the rest of the world. And so we need to get multiplicities and possibilities, pluralities on the table, not singulars. So thank you, Alberto, for that question.
Thank you, Professor. We have a lot of people online saying thank you for your contribution, your conference. They are very pleased. We have no more questions from YouTube. I think Carlos Ornelas had a question for you.
Thank you very much, Israel. Well, before the question, I thank you very much, Susan, for this wonderful presentation, for these reflections that you present us. And about this research, you didn't cite the research precisely that the more you invest in early childhood education, the less you invest in prisons. That's good. Can you not immediately on that an insight, and the other one, when we look at the future, we tend to be somehow linearly dependent in our position, and you present us a very beautiful, right, these 5 scenarios. And what is the robo education? Can you, I don't know if you can expand a little bit on this conception?
Okay. So robo education is the rise of robotics, artificial intelligence, and so on. And in many places, just to take that last question first, robotics, the future is with technology, artificial intelligence, and it's kind of put up there as an inevitable future. That in fact, we are now into something very different. We don't need to do things. Someone else is going to do thinking for us, and so on. And I have a problem with that as an inevitable future. No future is inevitable. Okay? We might want to regulate, for example, certain kinds of artificial intelligence. And the example I'm going to give here, a firm that had, here in the United Kingdom, that had downloaded 2 billion images of faces here in the United Kingdom without permission for individuals, was wanting to use those faces for face recognition. Now we might, and they were actually fined, and they have to delete the whole of the data base. Because what we also know with face recognition systems is that you can superimpose onto bodies and faces, other faces that are maybe not your own face, okay? And we see this not only as part of the, so not so much just the fake news, but actually faking of identities. So we might want to say that our capacities technologically to superimpose or impose on an image a particular face that you steal from somewhere, that we would actually want to regulate those out. You know, so can we not begin to think about what is it that we want from algorithmic governance, algorithms, new forms of artificial intelligence, and can we actually be intelligent ourselves, which is what Arendt would be asking for, around the conversations and the questions that we might want to ask in a very wide and deep way about the so-called inevitability of robotics and artificial intelligence. We don't have to accept these as inevitable futures. This is very well known to, on the issue of where do you invest your money in education. And it's very well known to policymakers that the European policymakers, for example, and certainly we know this in the United States, and actually Head Start was a good example. When you invest well in early years education, you reap the benefits from children actually to some extent mediating the consequences of uneven starts in life, and those uneven starts in life that then repeat themselves through the schooling system. You get rejected through the schooling system, possibly through not doing well, not because you're not intelligent, but because actually often you don't have the resources to remain in school. And we see this in terms of the rates of incarceration and so on. And there's research, and I can go find that for you, but it certainly would be the research that we would have been presenting to European policymakers. The more you invest in early years education, you reap the benefits in terms of success at school and actually moving into the labour market more successfully, rather than moving out into the world of prisons and so on.
Thank you very much. I appreciate, especially this idea that it's not inevitable. It doesn't have to be that way necessarily.
No, because by definition, the future hasn't happened. Mm-hmm. So it is up to, and so my plea is for educators to also step in with their wisdom and their questions and their knowledge to actually be a part of a debate, to not accept it as inevitable, robotics, artificial intelligence, corporate world, and so on, but actually something different. We want something different. And I would actually point to the younger generation. Many of them have been campaigning on climate change, have been organising, look down into Chile and the student movement. They are asking questions of our generation. And we have to actually come up with better solutions with the younger generation for how those questions get asked as part of the schooling curriculum, and that in fact young people are part of the deliberative kind of democracy that actually, as Arendt wants us to do, thinks about just educational futures, or Eric Olin Wright.
Yes. Thank you very much. You provide a very good insights that we may naturalize them for our own discussions within Mexico. Thank you very much, Susan.
My pleasure.
Thank you very much, Professor. I don't know if there's more questions from the people here on Zoom. Marco Navarro Zaira.
Yes, thank you very much for your lecture, for your talk. It was very interesting indeed. My question is that it's about the internal colonization, not only the external. Within the countries, there is always a sort of tension between the center and the periphery about policy making.
Yes.
So that these scenarios, these 5 scenarios for the future, there we have different shapes for the countries, and they will have different shapes within the countries. So the question is, do you see any possibilities for the decentralization movements or for self-reliance public education in the countries?
This is, Marco, a lovely question. And this is always a difficult one, isn't it? Because we can decentralize, but in the moment of decentralizing, if, for example, the resources that are available are potentially the tax base, as we have in the United States, of the local community, then if it's not a particularly wealthy local community, then essentially the right to, which is the part of the social contract, the right to an equal education, whether you're in a rural area or a city area, can't be honoured. Or if you're in a neighbourhood, let's take Mexico City, where we've got very different kinds of communities, some very wealthy, others significantly less so, and so on. So what there always needs, we can aim for, it seems to me, situatedness and locality, but that always needs to be evened up in some way through forms of redistribution, and those forms of redistribution might come at the national level or the subnational level that enables that, in Eric Olin Wright's terms, social and political social justice to take place. And I know sometimes, well, in fact, it's when we look around the world, we can see some of the Nordic countries more recently, not all of them actually, but some of the Nordic countries are more equal. Netherlands, Switzerland, they've grown in greater degrees of equality, rather than the reverse, where we've got some countries where we've got United States, the United Kingdom, they've become more unequal since the 1980s. The United States has become more unequal since the 1980s. In the United States, there's been some resource distribution at the federal level in the United States. But in fact, nevertheless, most of the taxes are paid at the local level. So we would need mechanisms, it seems to me, for sure, local knowledges and local decision making and so on, degrees of autonomy in those spaces. But autonomy can't come at the cost of actually having few resources in order to enable participation in society. And societies, different countries get that formula. It's better than in other countries, but it needs to be an aspiration in some way. We know education costs money. We pay teachers' wages. The most costs to do with education are to do with the cost of teachers' wages. But what we also know, if we take the Finnish case, for instance, education systems are outstandingly good when we pay teachers a proper wage. And when we pay teachers to be well educated, and in the Arendt kind of sense of that word. And that represents an investment, and most organisations recognise that include McKinsey and many of the consultancy firms. The best education systems are those that value their teachers. But we can't just value our teachers with words. We also need to actually value our teachers with enabling them to have a proper wage, to invest in their own learning, their own professional development, and the benefits come to those societies and to their communities.
Yeah, right. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much once again, Professor. On behalf of the Mexican Society of Comparative Education, the Faculty of Human Sciences of the Autonomous University of Baja California, and our other host, I would like to express our gratitude for your intellectual generosity. Your stimulating and provoking ideas and arguments have certainly given us plenty to think and reflect upon. We hope to have you here back in the near future, possibly in person, to continue with these conversations. Thank you very much. Agradecemos a quienes están conectados y les invitamos a que sigan participando en los trabajos del resto del día y la semana. La siguiente actividad es el panel de expertos Educación para el Desarrollo Sostenible, que se llevará a cabo en, si no me equivoco, a las 12 del día, hora de la Ciudad de México, 10 de la mañana, hora local en Baja California. Con esto damos concluida la sesión de conferencia magistral del día de hoy. Que tengan un excelente día.
Thank you very, very much. And I wish you all the very best for your conversations in the Congress. And again, it's been an honor and a privilege to be with you today and to speak with you and share my thoughts about just educational futures. Thank you.
Thank you very much, dear Susan. I hope to see you soon in February in Washington, D.C., and probably later on at Monash.
Definitely.
Oh,
Thank
well.
you. Thank you very, very much.